think ultimately investors will like to know the likelihood of a geopolitical risk premium pushing oil prices up to above $100 or even near 150.
I think over 100 is easy. If we have an unconstrained Israel-Iran conflict, if the gloves come off, then what that means is that Iran is going to have to conduct some strikes against oil infrastructure to basically punish the United States for not restraining Israel, and try to force the United States to restrain Israel. And those things can get that price up pretty high, particularly if the U.S. then, if the Biden administration concludes that they've already lost the election, then they're not limited at all, and they can really go after Iran, and Iran would then pull some of its aces out of its sleeve.
Will the war between Israel and Iran and their allies escalate beyond control? What is the most likely outcome for the oil price? Who is more likely to win the U.S. presidential elections in November at this point? And what will happen to foreign policy with China in either a Trump win or a Biden win? These are the issues we'll be addressing with Matt Gertken, Chief Geopolitical Strategist at BCA Research, who will break down all these geopolitical hotspots and issues with us, and ultimately what this means for investors. First, a word from our sponsor, iTrust Capital, an IRA that offers 35 crypto assets and the lowest trading fees in the crypto IRA space at 1%. If you're over 18 and you'd like to open a new account with cash or roll over an existing account, click on itrust.capital/David in the link down below to learn more and get started. And you can get a $100 signing bonus if you fund your account using my link. Matt, welcome back to the show. Always good to see you.
Thank you very much, David. Good to be with you always.
Turbulent times. Let's start with the Middle East before we talk about the U.S. elections. So the question on everyone's mind is, what will Israel do next? What is Israel's most likely response to the Iranian drone strike over the weekend, do you think?
Israel will probably conduct a limited strike on Iranian soil to demonstrate that attacks on Israeli soil will be met with the like response. They do not have the backing of the United States to conduct a sweeping, crippling attack on Iranian infrastructure or nuclear facilities. And so I think what they may really do is do a limited strike on the soil, but then also conduct strikes against proxies in the region that are Iranian proxies.
Some pundits have pointed out that Iran's drone strike over the weekend was just for show. Iran was most likely aware that Israel's Iron Dome system could shoot down any and all airstrikes, including drones and missiles, and that's exactly what happened. From a conventional military perspective, this was largely an ineffective operation, minimal damage caused. And so was this all for show? Was that your impression?
It was incredible that they could launch 300 projectiles and only cause one casualty and hit an air base in Israel and not do any significant damage to that base. So it's incredible because it shows the Israeli and allied air defense capabilities, but it also shows the way that Iran was able to sort of calibrate their weaponry and calibrate their attack in order to send a shot across the bow and not actually ignite a regional war from the get-go. However, I do think that's the direction we're heading, because remember that the purpose here is to sort of bait the Israelis into striking the first blow. And the Israelis may very well be willing to do that, because underlying all of this is the Iranian pursuit of a nuclear weapon. And that's something that Israel has an established military doctrine of opposing.
Okay. I'd like to show the audience a piece of work that you've done. This is an image showing a decision tree. It's called Israel-Iran Decision Tree through November 5th, 2024. I'll let you summarize your findings here, but it basically shows probabilities of certain events and outcomes given certain actions. What is your ultimate conclusion for?
Yeah, so we made that decision tree right after the Hamas attacks on October 7th, and it hasn't significantly changed since then. And the point was that we did not expect the war to be contained in Gaza or in Israel. We expected it to extend at least to Hezbollah and the Iranian proxies that pose the biggest threat to Israel, because effectively Israel's strategic choice is whether to accept a nuclear Iran or whether to accept a nuclear Iran with Hezbollah looming over Israel. And the second option is far inferior. So they have a huge incentive to push back on Hezbollah and at least move the strategic buffer zone out of northern Israel and back into southern Lebanon. So I think that's a key part of this. And the Iranians, by conducting that retaliation directly at Israel, they said, well, if you attack, our logistical supply chains leading to Hezbollah in Syria, then we will attack you directly. That was a major upping of the ante, and Israel will have to oppose that. And so I think we'll see them strike back pretty hard.
Does your decision tree factor in intervention from other allies of Iran?
Yeah, it does. What it assumes is that, and I mentioned earlier, that if the U.S. does not give Israel full backing to conduct a direct confrontation of Iran, then it probably won't happen. Although the probabilities show that it's sort of 60-40, really, 60% chance that the Israelis will not directly, extensively confront Iran without American support. Because if it goes wrong, then they end up both losing American support and not destroying the nuclear program in Iran, and that's the worst case scenario for Israel. So I think that they do depend on whether the Americans are willing to intervene. And during an election year, the American administration is going to be extremely averse to intervening in a Middle East war and causing an oil shock.
Okay, but Matt, why does Israel need American backing on this matter? Does Israel not have the military capabilities to confront Iran on its own?
Well, it depends on what we mean by confront. They can do a lot, and they have done a lot. They've sabotaged the nuclear programs many times, and they'll continue to do that. And they can use cyber attacks, and they can use missile strikes. There's a lot that they can do to disrupt Iran. And just this year alone, they have attacked the north-south natural gas pipeline in Iran. So there's a lot happening beneath the surface. But in order to really cripple either the regime or to cripple the nuclear program, you would need American support. You'd need American support because it's just such an extensive air operation. And it's one where you would have trouble operating at that long of a distance, also avoiding the airspace of certain other countries, being able to refuel, being able to target appropriately. And also, of course, some of these facilities are deeply fortified and embedded in the mountains. And so it's just hard for Israel to do on their own.
And didn't China and Russia support Iran, or at least verbally give their support?
Well, I think that's a key part of this, is that remember that what people in the region are looking forward to, or not looking forward to, is a nuclear armed Iran backed by Russia and China. And that is an Iran that over a long period of time could really dominate the region. And so what we see is a nascent alliance formation between the Gulf Arabs and the Israelis to try to create a cordon around Iran and contain Iran. And that's the reason why the Iranians have initiated a more aggressive strategy to try to punch through and breach that cordon and make sure that it doesn't happen, and try to divide and isolate Israel in particular. And they're having some success at that based on the events in Gaza. The problem is that then by attacking Israel, they've now changed the narrative so that now the spotlight really is back on Iran. And I think that just shows a lack of regime self-control. The regime is unstable at home, economically and socially. It's facing a succession process, a leadership change eventually, and it doesn't really have a good plan for that. And basically, it's striking out in a more aggressive fashion that is calling attention to this nuclear weaponization trajectory, and that's then building a larger resistance to Iran.
Okay, so far from what I've seen, it looks like the part of the decision tree in which you called Iran to have a limited military involvement is playing out. You've assigned a 30% chance of that happening. That's currently happening. At what point, or what would be the catalyst for this to evolve into your 70% scenario in which Iran intervenes aggressively?
Yeah, I think the way to see this is that if the Israelis conduct serious strikes on Iranian soil, meaning that there's high casualties or just a few deaths, honestly, would do the trick, or that they damage critical infrastructure, which would include the nuclear facilities, obviously, then the Iranians will retaliate aggressively. And they've said that, and that's obvious. So I think we're very much at that juncture now, and it will be important to see the Israeli response. And at that point, we'll have to change all those probabilities, and we'll have to drastically increase the odds of a region-wide war. And of course, the probabilities in that chart that you're referring to are ultimately centered on whether it will affect the oil supply, because that's what investors care about. And the point there is that in order to see this fighting truly affect the oil supply, the Iranians have to be willing to see an American response. And what they generally want to do is avoid that. And so they're trying to isolate Israel, but if Israel hits them hard enough, they're going to have to hit back, and that's where it's going to start to affect the oil supply.
Is it in Iran's best interest to intervene aggressively and thus start a major war? I mean, in essence, wouldn't that cause a major oil shock per your chart and boost their oil revenues potentially?
Well, it won't boost their revenues because their facilities will get destroyed. What it would do, though, it's not in their interest, right? And that's the key point here. What they want to do is isolate. They want to split Israel off from the U.S. They want to force Joe Biden to choose between his reelection and Donald Trump's election. He has to choose between Israel and his own sort of administration. And that way he can choose, like any leader, he would choose his own survival politically. And that would cut off Israel, forcing Israel to sort of be restrained, forcing Israel to be put in a box by Iran. And that box is the idea that if they strike against Iranian, Revolutionary Guard members who are training proxy groups, that then they will be attacked at home. And so the issue is that the Israeli administration itself is probably not going to accept this outcome because they don't face an election in November. And in fact, if the election in the U.S. changes, it's really not the worst case scenario for the Netanyahu government. So Netanyahu probably will come out swinging a little bit harder than the Americans would prefer. And that could then send this on a negative trajectory. But I do think that the key point here is that Israel will want to push back Hezbollah, because if they do that, they're defending against any future major war. And meanwhile, they can satisfy the American requirement of not instigating a region-wide war.
Well, Lebanon, I think, is already partially involved. To what extent will they be more involved?
It could get a lot more. I mean, you're right. There definitely has been a handful of casualties and sort of significant strikes since October between Hezbollah and Israel, but we could see a very large degree of fighting there. That's because Hezbollah has been training since 2006 to be ready for a major confrontation. And so the point is that if Israel hits Iran, then of course they're going to face that retaliation from the north anyway. So maybe their best play, if the Americans are telling them not to hit Iran hard, is to just do something limited on Iran and then really focus their efforts on mowing back Hezbollah.
Well, the oil price, I'm looking at crude oil, it's been sliding since its high of $86 a barrel, 87 earlier this month. Do you think investors, or the oil market in particular, are just pricing a de-escalation at this point?
No, I think the market. I don't think the market is pricing a de-escalation right now. I think the market is dealing with a lot of different issues. We have evidence that restrictive monetary policy is going to slow down the economy, and we have a large supply of oil, particularly coming from the United States. And so there's just a lot of different macro factors that produce the oil price. But when we consider the reality that a region-wide war, like an unrestrained war in this region, can destroy more oil production than exists spare capacity. For example, OPEC spare capacity at about 5 million barrels per day, that can be exceeded by sweeping strikes on oil production. So the point here is that if it becomes a region-wide war in that 30% scenario, you can have a major oil shock that goes beyond the ability of the global economy to immediately compensate. And that's where it actually then causes the price to spike, and it causes a reduction in global demand for consumers who get hit with those higher prices. But you've got to see the worst case scenario there, because like I said earlier, the Iranians know that if they attack the oil flows, then the Americans are going to get involved, and it's going to end badly for them.
And October 6th, it's been 6 months since October. How long do you think this war against Hamas is going to continue?
Well, the war against Hamas is nearly concluded. And in fact, Israel is having to pivot and focus really more on Iran and Hezbollah now. so that while they were planning on going through, theoretically, they were planning on going through with a sort of operation in Rafah, the border crossing with Egypt, they may not do that now because they have bigger fish to fry. And so there's a point at which we stop focusing on Gaza. From a global point of view and from an investment point of view, what really matters now is whether this becomes the ultimate catalyst for deciding whether Iran gets to continue pursuing nuclear weapons. Because underlying the conflict is the Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons and regional ambitions. And the narrative is now shifting to that. And that's precisely what we forecasted is we said, well, look, the Gaza thing it's a terrible tragedy. And but it's ultimately from a global perspective, what structurally changes things is if Israel and Iran get into a conflict, and that's driven ultimately by Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Okay, and ultimately, for the foreseeable future, what is the win condition or scenario for Israel?
Best case scenario for Israel, and which is there's not a lot of great options right now, but basically if they can retain their alliances, which is one key reason why they shouldn't conduct extensive strikes on Iran without American permission. They need to retain their alliances. They need to form a containment coalition with the Gulf Arabs. So they need to maintain the ability to conduct, negotiations with Saudi Arabia, for example, on forming a security pact. And they need to assert this rule against Iran that they actually do have the right to conduct strikes in Syria and in the logistical chain that's feeding into Hezbollah and other militant groups. So they need to sort of inform Iran that they're still going to be doing that, and it won't, and it's not going to be allowed to then be responded to by attacking Israel. So if they can set up that sort of fence with Iran, and then they can retain their alliances and then move toward pushing back Hezbollah so that people in Israel can move back into the north of the country, that would be a big win for Israel.
Okay, well, since we're on decision trees and probabilities, I think ultimately investors would like to know the likelihood of a geopolitical risk premium pushing oil prices up to above $100 or even near 150. How likely would that scenario be?
Yeah, going above 100 is quite easy in a scenario where the economies just remain resilient and OPEC continues to discipline production, and then you have noise in the Middle East. Occasionally, Iran, doing symbolic strikes, taking out a tanker here and there like they did just the other day. So I think over 100 is easy. But once you get up to 120 and above, you should be then triggering some reactions from other producers. And so then it really gets tricky to predict. And what I would say is, again, if we have an unconstrained Israel-Iran conflict, if the gloves come off, then what that means is that Iran is going to have to conduct some strikes against oil infrastructure to basically punish the United States for not restraining Israel, and try to force the United States to restrain Israel. And those things can get that price up pretty high, particularly if the U.S. then, if the Biden administration concludes that they've already lost the election, then they're not limited at all, and they can really go after Iran, and Iran would then pull some of its aces out of its sleeve.
Well, that's another issue which we'll talk about when we talk about the elections. Are you suggesting, Matt, that the higher the oil price goes, the more sensitive this issue becomes and it starts to spiral, meaning that a higher oil price may actually push Iran to act more aggressively?
Yeah, it could happen that way. Yes, and the reason why, again, is that the Iranians, their intention, their goal here is not to take out oil production and cause the Americans to attack them. That's not their goal. But if things happen in such a way where they're trying to warn the Americans, they conduct a strike against oil, and then the Americans hit them hard, well, then all bets are off.
Is it also possible that a higher oil price would cause an economic contraction back home in the U.S., thus forcing the Fed to pivot sooner?
Well, yeah, it's possible. If the oil price doubles, it typically does cause a recession. So, if we move from, we were at, $80 per barrel not long ago, and if we get a major shock, right, it's going to take removing millions of barrels of oil per day, but a major shock that pushes the price up to 150 or above could start to produce that recessionary effect. And it's very clearly the case that as oil goes above 100, you see gasoline prices in America rise above $4 per gallon, and that already starts to put pressure on the politics. So, yeah.
But the Fed wouldn't lower rates if oil pushes inflation up, right?
So the Fed is in a tough spot there because they want to basically say this is an exogenous shock, it's transitory, and it's
Yeah.
not going to affect our view. But we live in a world now where overall inflation, inflation has sort of stopped falling, or it's looking a little sticky, and it's making the Fed nervous, and the market, of course, is pricing out these cuts. And I think the key takeaway here is that if it's a big shock that's going to have a recessionary impact by punishing the U.S. consumer, then in that case, yes, the Fed would actually start to shift. They'd start to turn more toward fighting a recession, but they might be a little slow to react because they don't want inflation expectations to become unanchored.
Okay, let's turn to U.S. politics now. I've heard the view, and please comment on this. I've heard the view that should Trump win, and I'll get your prognosis on this, but should Trump win, there may actually be a bearish reaction from oil, precisely because Trump has said on the campaign trail that he wants to make peace in the Middle East. He wants to strike a deal with Putin. These de-escalationary moves are going to remove the geopolitical risk premium. How would you respond to that?
It's possible, but I don't really think so. Let's say one thing: the likeliest scenario for Trump to win is a scenario where unemployment is rising in the U.S. We're moving into a recessionary dynamic, and so voters are angry and they vote for the opposite party, right? Well, that means that oil is falling. So it's not falling because of anything Trump did. It's falling because the business cycle ended, and that's why Trump got elected. So that's, first of all, that's the most likely sort of causal mechanism here. But in a scenario where a soft landing is achieved in the economy and sustained, and then somehow Trump wins anyway, which is possible, not maybe base case, but possible. So if that happens, well, how do his policies work? Well, first of all, he affects American production. If he deregulates or offers tax incentives, that affects him. But American production's already booming. And I don't really know that it can boom much more. It's just responding to market signals. So I don't know that he's really going to surge American production. He would withdraw support for Ukraine, and that could then signal something with regard to Russia. But remember that Russia's been getting its oil out anyway. Russia's been simply sending its oil to India and China. So it is making its oil out into the global market. So that doesn't change either. So really the only change is the Middle East. And there, I don't think Trump is credible when he says that he wants to focus on peace and peacemaking. That might be his intention, sure. But the truth is that a maximum pressure policy on Iran and a policy of denying them nuclear weapons, which is an American red line, and it's one that I think Trump would have to defend, that policy points us toward confrontation. And so we would, in fact, see oil prices still witnessing agitation as a result of a structural Middle Eastern contradiction between Iran's ambitions and Israel and America's stated red lines.
And like you pointed out to me before in our prior episode together, you said that either way, it's going to be their last term. Doesn't matter if it's Trump or Biden. How would the second term president view foreign policy differently than the first term?
That's exactly right. It's a key point, I think, too often overlooked, that Biden as well is a second term president. So Biden comes in and says, hey, I got reelected, and Iran, I'm not really very happy with you. I tried to negotiate with you for 4 years. You basically bit my hand and almost destroyed my election. So now here's how it's going to go. You freeze your nuclear program, or we're going to have a very bad day, And so, in other words, Biden is going to be rolling up his sleeves because as an American president, any American president, he has to address the fact that Iran is using proxies to attack Israel and attack international shipping and threaten American access to, the free flow of oil in that region. And so this is something he'll have to respond to. Now, he will be more inclined to participate in diplomacy if the Iranians then change their position and start to try to behave a little bit better from his point of view. Whereas I think Trump will be giving them more of an ultimatum because the Republican approach to Iran has never been, well, let's engage and let's try to open up Iran and create an economically vibrant, internationally integrated Iran. That's not been the Republican policy, and that wasn't Trump's policy when he was the president. So I think, in fact, the Biden could kick the can down the road, but it's not certain. Trump probably won't kick the can down the road because the Iranians are really going to be looking to get that nuclear deterrent faster if they think they're more likely to be attacked by an Israeli-American joint alignment.
Which president, if either one, is more likely to ameliorate relations with China?
I don't think either of them is very likely to do that. It's certainly not at the beginning. Biden will be well, first of all, Biden tried to tamp down tensions, and what we're seeing right in front of us over the past few weeks is that failed. And I did not expect it to succeed, but I'm just saying now we have the evidence that even Biden has not been able to restrain the China tensions because he's simultaneously trying to cut off their access to semiconductors and high technology. So needless to say, it's not going very well. And the Chinese are providing enormous strategic support for Russia and will continue to do that. So Biden's own China policy is now becoming a Trump policy. He's talking about raising tariffs. Janet Yellen's Treasury Secretary talking about sanctioning Chinese banks. He will be moving forward with the export controls in his second term. And Biden is quite effective at getting allies to help and participate, like the Dutch and the Japanese. So I think that's a big threat to China, and it would escalate, and at least initially. Now with Trump, he can use sweeping tariffs, but he doesn't get as much cooperation from foreign allies because he might also be putting tariffs on them as well. And China might view that as a sort of opportunity, but they're still going to be getting hit with broad-based tariffs, you know? So either way, we get deterioration with China in the early years of the next administration. And then if everything goes well, maybe toward the end of that administration, you could negotiate some kind of trade deal to de-escalate. But it's going to be escalation before de-escalation. And the point about second-term presidents is they don't really have to agree to a deal at the end of it.
Well, we know Xi Jinping's stance on reunification with Taiwan. Do you think President Biden or President Trump would have a different approach to that issue?
Biden's going to be consistent in that he will support democracies around the world and their ability to determine their own future and their relations with others. And that means he'll be happy to sell weapons to Taiwan and maybe negotiate a free trade deal with Taiwan. And a lot of things that he will do will be threatening to China. And that's part of the status quo. But he's as we've seen, his administration will push the status quo as far as possible in the direction of U.S. Taiwan, not only cooperation, but preparation for, a bad situation with China, which can mean more arms sales and more effective and more useful arms sales. Trump, the truth is, I don't think Trump, even if he withdraws support for Ukraine, I don't think he can afford to withdraw support for Taiwan. It's much more important for U.S. strategy, Taiwan.
I understand. Ultimately now, as of mid-April, who has a better chance of winning?
As of right now, I still think it's Biden slightly favored. That's a low conviction view, but I think that there has not yet been a thorough discrediting of this administration objectively in a way that drives swing state voters to overturn the sitting party and the sitting president. But Middle East crisis is, if you have a low approval rating and a Middle East crisis, then that's going to start to look like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think I have to be ready to change that view if American voters get hit by higher energy prices.
Right. So Biden's, I guess, objective right now is just to maintain status quo, make sure inflation doesn't get out of control, make sure the Middle East doesn't spiral out of control, and make sure the economy doesn't plummet into recession, right? So
yeah, it's a very narrow path, and it could easily be toppled over, and he could lose. But as things stand today, I think he's still slightly favored.
Is there a higher probability of the recession rolling over by November in the U.S.?
Well, it won't be a designated recession at this point, but it's clear that unemployment is moving up in several states, and that we see a softening of labor demand, and so you could really start to see everything turn in the economy, and that of course is the number one reason why Biden would be overthrown. Because if you've got a 41% approval rating and unemployment's rising, it doesn't matter what happens to inflation. Inflation can keep coming down. You're still going to lose the election.
Finally, any other wild cards we haven't talked about yet that could sway the outcome either way?
I mean, the big wild cards, exogenous factors, it's hard for outside forces to affect the U.S. election, but oil is one area where that can happen. With China, if things escalate, it could even help Biden because he can look very tough on China, and it may not affect the consumer in time to change their mentality in the election. So, I would be sort of aware of those issues, but otherwise, the border has been wide open, and immigration could continue to emerge as a defining issue of the election. It could happen. Also, these abortion referendums in places like Arizona and Florida, if they're really scheduled to happen at the same time as the election, they could drive huge turnout for the Democrats and support for the Democrats if the economy is otherwise doing okay. And so I think those are some of the key swing factors.
Excellent. Well, we'll follow up again, definitely before the election. Lots to talk about for sure before November. Thank you very much, Matt, for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David.
Where can we learn from you and BCA Research before we go?
BCAresearch.com, geopolitical strategy. Thank you.
We'll put the link down in the description below, so make sure to follow Matt and BCA Research. I'm David Lynn. Stay tuned for more.